The goal of this overall consultation is how to make nutritious diets more affordable, accessible, and adequate for the population. In order to address that question, we first need to understand the current challenges. It's broadly known that prospects for SDGs being realized under business as usual are by 2030 are rather weak. Rapid pace of consistent decline in global poverty and hunger, which occurred until about 2015, had slowed well before COVID came on the scene. Besides, much of this reduction in poverty and hunger occurred in China and Southeast Asia. Uh, and COVID has, of course, been a very big tragedy all over the world, but particularly for the poorest in the world. And it's compounded by the fact that there are severe impacts of climate change which have also affected these particular parts of the world that have made slow progress in reduction in poverty and hunger. So, migrant labor that worked in urban areas has, in many cases, returned to rural areas with greater dependence on food and agriculture. And if anything, agricultural transformation, which was supposed to create more urban employment, more people making earnings at higher rates, has been set back as a result of these two developments. Slowness overall, even before COVID, compounded by the incidence of COVID. Similarly, child mortality rates, which had made progress rapidly, had slowed down. And on the other hand, dietary transition in the patterns of food consumption has been very rapid. And this transition has been largely to shift food patterns to junk food, which is cheaper to buy and more widely available, as a result of which there is a combination of hunger combined with obesity and incidence of non-communicable diseases, which has increased, including heart cancer, diabetes, etc. So that is the challenge that we are dealing with today. If we look at this in terms of where the problem is most concentrated, it's in Africa and South Asia rather. So the largest amount of poor people in the world, um, poverty estimated at less than $1.9 per capita per day, was highest in Africa. 62% of the poor in the world resided in Africa in the recent years, whereas 25% of those in South Asia. Whereas if we take into account the extent of undernourishment, then 40% of the undernourished in the world were in South Asia and 34% in sub-Saharan Africa. Quite frankly, this disjuncture that we see between the incidence of poverty and incidence of hunger and the changes in them over time is something that we haven't quite fully understood. And it is an area which requires much more attention than has received so far. So then what is needed is to address the situation both uh, from the supply side and the demand side, if the objective is to achieve these ambitious goals of nutritious food accessible in adequate quantities for all people in the world. On the supply side, we need to look at increase in production and net imports. I'll come to the discussion of net imports in a little while. And then on the demand side, the question of the need for widespread increase in effective demand for healthy food, which has many different components to it. One is the need for increased employment and incomes, um, increased consumer education, efficient low cost value chains backed by effective food safety regulation measures, increased physical infrastructure, and not the least important role for the private sector that is not just focused on private profits but also on corporate social responsibility, which means doing no harm and doing good. So, what what is the situation with productivity growth across the world? On the supply side, there are huge differences in the growth in total factor productivity and import dependence among countries. We can see it in two slides. First, in Asia, within Asia, differences among countries, and across the regions between Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America in the next two slides. Before we go to those slides, it's important to recognize that productivity growth estimates don't take into account changes in the state of natural resources, such as growing water shortages, soil depletion, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, etc. If we actually took those into account, then we may come to the conclusion that these estimates of productivity growth need to be modified to adjust for natural resource management. So the first slide here shows the differences among countries in Asia, and South Korea was the country that experienced very rapid growth in TFP, followed by China in a later period. And India's productivity growth has been intermediate, not as high as it was in China, and the slowest or lowest growth in Bangladesh. But in all cases, these productivity growth changes have been taking place over time, so one has to look at them carefully. Across the regions of the world, again, Southeast Asia and East Asia, China in particular, experience very rapid growth in productivity, followed by Latin America, and the least growth was in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is where, as we discussed earlier, there is huge incidence of poverty and also large incidence of undernourishment. So the reasons for differences in productivity growth are many. One of the important ones is the differences in investment in R&D, in which China excels. China towers over other countries in Asia as well as in Latin America and Africa. There are also major differences in infrastructure, in roads, cold storages, telecommunications, financial markets, in human capital, and in trade dependence. And in all these areas, China has made huge progress because it invested a lot in each of these areas compared to other countries in the world. Consequence of this growth in productivity, however, is combined with the fact that per capita calorie consumption across the world is very different. It's the highest in North America, followed by South America and the Middle East, and the lowest in Asia. Although the growth in per capita availability, the blue line, for instance, has been particularly rapid in Asia, as one can see from this figure over time. Trade has been very important for achieving balanced supplies of food. And trade dependence has varied a lot among countries of the world. Thus, US, for instance, depends 10% for 10% of its supplies on imports, net imports. So Europe about 30%, but India only 3%. And Latin America's import dependence has increased a lot, both in cereal imports and in other imports, as we can see in the next slide. But there are big differences across countries in terms of dependence on trade as a source of food supply. Foreign aid has not been as important as one would think, and the World Bank, for instance, played a very major role in the generation of the Green Revolution, not just in India, but all over Southeast Asia. But here the numbers show that by 2019, about $11.5 billion were disbursed by in ODA overall, of which these international organizations and including the World Bank, CGI are very important players. But 540 billion uh, came to developing countries in terms of remittances, and and developing countries invested about 200 billion of their own resources in food and agriculture. So Reardon, in his studies of indigenous value chains, points out that there has been a quiet revolution taking place in different parts of the world, including in Southeast Asia and India, Bangladesh, which is not only led by multinational corporations and governments, but by small enterprises, leading to investments in cold storages, for instance, which has made a very big difference to connecting farmers with consumers over time. And this has all been a result of political security, roads, electrification, urban demand, and dependence on subsidies, in his view, has not been as great as generally believed. Recent studies of investment gaps in R&D, for instance, one commissioned by Commission on Sustainable Intensification, show that there is a gap of investment, innovation investment gap of about $15 billion per year, of which 4 billion in R&D, 6.5 billion in climate related technologies, and 4.7 billion in improving water management. All these investments, if and when they occur, of course have to be accompanied by substantial amount of investment in policies and technologies of the kind and institutions of the kind that will make this investment productive. And publications coming out of these studies are listed below. So to return to the overall picture, it's quite clear that it's a combination of concentration of multinationalization and characterized by climate change and capital-led intensification, but also incipient emergence of branding, labeling, packaging, new organizational arrangements which combine or link producers to consumers, and economic policies of market and foreign direct investment, deregulation, liberalization, hard and soft physical infrastructure. All these factors have played an important role in improving access to food and nutritious food for a large number of people. But it's quite clear from the presentation I made that we have a long way to go and far more resources, policies, and institutions are needed in order to achieve the ambitious goal of access to nutritious food in adequate quantities for all. Thank you.